A man trained as a civil enginear, with no background whatsoever in fashion or luxury goods, spent 4 decades acquiring individual heritage brands one by one until he'd assembled the largest luxury goods empire the world had ever seen. His name is Bernard Arnault. Born in France in 1949, he graduated from a top engineering school and initially worked in his family's construction business before making an unusual pivot in the early 1980s that would define the rest of his career. He began acquiring struggling textile and fashion companies, seeing genuine value in historic brand names that current management simply wasn't capitalizing on effectively. In 1984, Arnault acquired a struggling textile group that included, among its various holdings, the fashion house Christian Dior. Morgan Housel has written that some of the most successful acquirers in business history aren't the ones who understand a specific product category better than anyone else, but the ones who understand something more fundamental about brand value and organizational capability, applicable across many different specific product categories. Arnault's engineering background gave him limited direct fashion expertise, but a genuinely sharp analytical eye for identifying undervalued brand equity trapped inside poorly managed companies. Throughout the late 1980s, Arnault continued acquiring additional luxury and fashion assets, eventually engineering a series of complex corporate maneuvers to gain control of Louis Vuitton Moët Hennessy, a company formed from an earlier merger of the Louis Vuitton fashion house and the Moët Hennessy Champagne and Spirits Group. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized identifying genuine underlying value that current market pricing hadn't yet fully recognized. Arnault's specific insight was that individual luxury heritage brands, each with decades or centuries of established prestige, represented significantly undervalued assets when analyzed purely as brands rather than simply as their current, often struggling operating businesses. Daniel Kahneman's research into how established organizations can become trapped in outdated operational approaches, even while sitting on genuinely valuable underlying brand assets, helps explain why Arnault found so many acquisition opportunities among historic luxury houses during this period. Many of these storied brands had built genuine prestige over decades, but their existing management often lacked the specific business discipline and capital allocation skill needed to fully capitalize on that brand value at a larger commercial scale. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about understanding what actually generates ongoing value applies here with particular relevance to Arnault's specific strategy. Rather than building new brands from scratch, he recognized that acquiring and properly managing already established prestige brands, each with genuine, difficult-to-replicate heritage and customer loyalty already built over decades, represented a more reliable path to sustained value creation than attempting to build equivalent brand equity from nothing. Over the following decades, Arnault's LVMH conglomerate grew to include dozens of prestigious brands across fashion, jewelry, watches, wines and spirits, and cosmetics, including Louis Vuitton, Christian Dior, Tiffany & Company, Bulgari, Moët and Chandon, and Sephora, among many others. By managing this portfolio of individually prestigious brands under a shared corporate structure, while carefully maintaining each brand's distinct identity and exclusivity rather than diluting them into a single generic corporate offering, Arnault built the largest luxury goods company in the world. By various points in recent years, Arnault has ranked among the wealthiest individuals on earth, with his personal fortune closely tied to LVMH's continued commercial success and the enduring appeal of the luxury brand portfolio he's assembled and carefully managed over 4 decades. Here's an honest complication worth including, since Arnault's specific acquisition style has drawn genuine criticism throughout his career. He earned the nickname, the Wolf in Cashmere, in French business circles for his notably aggressive, sometimes hostile approach to acquiring companies, including contested takeover attempts that drew significant criticism from some of the founding families and existing management teams whose companies he pursued, some of whom viewed his approach as prioritizing financial control over the more traditional, family-oriented values many heritage luxury houses had historically emphasized. George S. Classen's advice about recognizing genuine, underappreciated value applies directly to Arnault's specific career-long strategy. His fortune wasn't built by inventing a new luxury product category, but by recognizing that many individual heritage brands, each valuable but often undermanaged on their own, could generate significantly more combined value when properly organized and capitalized under unified, disciplined corporate leadership. This isn't a simple story suggesting aggressive acquisition strategies always succeed, or that Arnault's specific approach to acquiring historic family companies was without genuine controversy or cost to those on the other side of his takeover attempts. What makes his story worth remembering is the specific pattern it illustrates. Sometimes the most valuable business skill isn't deep expertise in any single product category, but the ability to recognize undervalued brand equity across multiple categories, and the discipline to properly organize and capitalize on that value once acquired. So here's a question worth sitting with. Is there an underappreciated asset, skill, or reputation in your own life or business that's genuinely valuable, but simply isn't being organized or capitalized on as effectively as it could be? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever recognized genuine value in something others had overlooked or undermanaged, simply because you looked at it from a different analytical angle than everyone else had? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most insightful stories on this channel come from people who've spotted exactly this kind of overlooked value in their own careers or investments. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Bernard Arnault didn't build the world's largest luxury empire by understanding fashion better than anyone else. He built it by understanding brand value better than the people who were actually running those brands. A man once considered the wealthiest person in America spent the final decades of his life living in darkened hotel rooms, refusing to cut his hair or nails, terrified of germs to a degree that left him isolated from almost everyone around him. His name was Howard Hughes. Born in Texas in 1905, he inherited his father's tool manufacturing company at 18 after both parents died within a few years of each other, and used that inheritance to fund an extraordinary range of ventures across aviation, filmmaking, and eventually a vast business empire spanning defense contracting and real estate. In his younger years, Hughes was genuinely remarkable, a daring aviator who personally set multiple world speed records flying aircraft he'd helped design, a Hollywood film producer and director behind several successful and controversial movies, and a shrewd businessman who built Hughes Aircraft Company into a major defense contractor. Morgan Housel has written that early, dramatic success can sometimes mask underlying instabilities that only become visible much later, once the specific pressures and isolation that come with extreme wealth and fame have had years to compound. Hughes survived several serious aviation accidents throughout his career, including a nearly fatal crash in 1946 that left him with significant, lasting injuries and, according to several biographers, may have contributed to or intensified underlying psychological difficulties, including what many mental health professionals who've studied his life have described as symptoms consistent with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized the discipline of separating an asset's genuine value from surrounding noise and distraction. Hughes, in his early business career, demonstrated something similar in his professional judgment, but as his personal psychological difficulties intensified over subsequent decades, that same discipline appears to have become increasingly difficult for him to maintain, both in his personal life and, eventually, in aspects of his business decision-making as well. Daniel Kahneman's research into how untreated mental health conditions can compound over time, particularly without adequate treatment or support, helps illuminate part of Hughes's later trajectory. As his specific fears, particularly around germs and contamination, intensified throughout the 1950s and 1960s, he became increasingly isolated, eventually living for extended periods in darkened hotel rooms, communicating with the outside world primarily through a small circle of aides, while his personal hygiene and physical health deteriorated dramatically despite his access to essentially unlimited financial resources. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about understanding what actually generates lasting value applies here in an unusual, deeply human direction. Hughes's business empire, for years, continued operating and generating substantial revenue even as his own personal life became increasingly dysfunctional, a stark illustration that financial success and personal well-being, while sometimes connected, are ultimately separate outcomes that don't automatically protect each other. By the time of his death in 1976, Hughes had become almost a mythological figure specifically because of how completely he'd withdrawn from public life during his final years, despite remaining, on paper, one of the wealthiest people in the country. His actual physical condition at death, according to medical examiners, reflected severe malnutrition and other serious, long-standing health problems that his enormous wealth had done essentially nothing to prevent or address. Here's an honest complication worth including, since Hughes's later psychological difficulties are sometimes discussed without appropriate care or accuracy. Hughes was never formally diagnosed with a specific mental health condition during his own lifetime, given both the era's more limited understanding of obsessive-compulsive disorder and his own extreme isolation from any consistent medical care during his later years. Subsequent analysis by mental health historians examining his documented behavior patterns has suggested probable OCD and related conditions, but these remain retrospective assessments rather than a formal, contemporaneous clinical diagnosis. George S. Classen's advice about wealth being valuable specifically for what it enables in a person's actual life applies here as a genuinely sobering counterpoint. Hughes's fortune, by the end of his life, had failed to purchase him basic physical comfort, meaningful relationships, or genuine peace, illustrating clearly that financial resources alone, without adequate attention to underlying well-being, can't automatically produce a life anyone would genuinely want to live. This isn't a simple story warning that wealth itself causes psychological suffering, or suggesting Hughes's specific difficulties were somehow an inevitable consequence of his success. Many extraordinarily wealthy people live full, connected, genuinely healthy lives. What makes Hughes's story worth remembering, with appropriate care regarding how we discuss mental health, is the specific illustration it offers. Financial success, however extraordinary, doesn't automatically address underlying psychological difficulties, and can sometimes even provide the specific isolation and resources that allow those difficulties to deepen largely unchecked by the kind of outside intervention ordinary life circumstances might otherwise provide. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you were suddenly given unlimited financial resources tomorrow, do you have people in your life who would genuinely tell you if your behavior or well-being seemed to be declining, rather than simply going along with whatever you wanted? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Do you think extreme wealth makes it harder for people to get genuine, honest feedback about their own well-being from those around them? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most thoughtful reflections on this channel come from people who've seen how isolation, wealth, or power can affect someone's ability to receive honest feedback. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Howard Hughes had enough money to buy almost anything in the world. He simply couldn't buy the one thing that might have actually helped, someone close enough, and trusted enough, to tell him the truth. If you or someone you know is struggling with symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder or other mental health challenges, please reach out to a mental health professional. Support and effective treatment are available. In late March 2021, several of the world's largest, most sophisticated investment banks discovered within the span of a single weekend that they'd collectively been exposed to roughly $30 billion in losses from a single, relatively obscure investment fund that most of Wall Street had never even heard of. The fund was Archegos Capital Management, run by a man named Bill Hwang. Hwang had previously run a hedge fund called Tiger Asia, which pleaded guilty to criminal fraud charges related to insider trading in 2012, resulting in Hwang being barred from managing outside investor money in several jurisdictions for a period. Rather than disappearing from finance entirely, Hwang restructured his operation as a family office, managing what was technically his own personal wealth rather than outside client money, a structure that allowed him to avoid many of the disclosure requirements and regulatory scrutiny that applied to traditional hedge funds managing other people's capital. Morgan Housel has written that regulatory categories designed decades ago for one purpose sometimes create enormous, unintended blind spots once financial markets evolve in ways the original rules never anticipated. Family offices were traditionally conceived as vehicles for wealthy families to manage their own money privately, without the disclosure obligations designed to protect outside investors who don't have direct access to the fund manager's actual positions and strategy. Huang's specific insight, whether intentional or simply a byproduct of his particular circumstances following his earlier legal troubles, was that this exemption let him build an enormous, highly leveraged position in global markets with almost none of the transparency that would normally have alerted regulators, banks, or the broader market to the genuine scale of risk accumulating inside his fund. Archegos built massive concentrated positions in a relatively small number of stocks, including Viacom CBS, Discovery, and several Chinese technology companies, using a specific financial instrument called a total return swap. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized diversification and margin of safety specifically to protect against exactly the kind of concentrated risk Archegos was building. Huang's strategy represented almost a direct rejection of that discipline, with the fund's fortune becoming increasingly tied to the performance of a small handful of stocks, using enormous leverage to amplify the size of those positions far beyond what the fund's actual underlying capital would otherwise support. The specific mechanism Huang used, the total return swap, deserves particular attention because it explains exactly how banks ended up so catastrophically exposed without fully understanding their own collective risk. Rather than directly owning shares in these companies, Archegos entered into swap agreements with multiple different investment banks, where each bank would technically hold the actual shares while Archegos received the economic exposure to that stock's price movement, paying the bank fees and interest in exchange. Because these swap agreements were conducted privately between Archegos and each individual bank, none of the banks Archegos worked with, including Credit Suisse, Nomura, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs, among others, had complete visibility into how much total exposure Archegos had built across all of its relationships combined. Daniel Kahneman's research into how information fragmented across multiple parties can obscure risk that would be immediately obvious if concentrated within a single, complete view helps explain precisely why this specific structure proved so dangerous. Any individual bank, examining only its own relationship with Archegos, might have seen a position that appeared reasonably sized and adequately collateralized. But Archegos had built substantially similar concentrated positions simultaneously across several different banks, meaning the fund's true aggregate leverage and concentration risk was dramatically higher than what any single lender's own risk models could see, since no single lender had visibility into what Archegos was simultaneously doing with its competitors. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about understanding exactly what risk an asset or position actually carries applies here with genuine systemic significance. The banks lending to Archegos believed they held adequately collateralized positions with acceptable risk, based on their own individual relationship with the fund. In reality, because Archegos had fragmented its true total exposure across multiple lenders who couldn't see each other's exposure, the actual systemic risk embedded in the fund's overall position was dramatically larger and more concentrated than any individual bank's internal risk assessment could have possibly detected. In late March 2021, Viacom CBS announced a stock offering that caused its share price to decline sharply, triggering margin calls across Archegos' highly leveraged positions. As the fund failed to meet these margin calls, its lending banks began liquidating the underlying collateral, the actual shares each bank held as part of its swap arrangement with Archegos, in a rapid, largely uncoordinated sequence. Since each bank was independently trying to minimize its own specific losses without full visibility into how the other banks were simultaneously reacting to the same unfolding crisis. This uncoordinated, simultaneous liquidation caused the affected stocks to collapse even further and faster than the initial trigger alone would have caused, since each bank's individual selling added additional downward pressure that made every other bank's position worse in a rapid, self-reinforcing spiral. Credit Suisse alone reported losses of approximately $5.5 billion from its exposure to Archegos, contributing significantly to a broader crisis of confidence in the bank's risk management practices that persisted for years afterward and arguably contributed to the broader institutional troubles that eventually led to Credit Suisse's 2023 collapse and emergency acquisition by UBS. It's worth examining more closely why banks were willing to extend such enormous leverage to a single client with a documented history of securities fraud in the first place. According to subsequent reporting, Archegos generated substantial trading commissions and fees for the banks it worked with, creating a direct financial incentive for individual relationship managers and trading desks to compete for a larger share of Huang's business, even as some internal risk teams reportedly raised concerns about the scale of exposure being extended. This dynamic, where the people generating revenue from a relationship have different incentives than the people responsible for assessing its risk, recurs constantly throughout financial history, and Archegos represents merely one of its more dramatic modern examples. Some banks, notably Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, reportedly recognized the deteriorating situation slightly earlier than Credit Suisse and Nomura, and moved to liquidate their own collateral positions first, meaning the specific order in which each bank reacted meaningfully determined how much of the total loss each institution ultimately absorbed, turning what was already a chaotic unwind into something resembling a race among sophisticated